Okay. Okay, good morning. I'm honored to chair this session that starts with the keynote speech of James Loudermilk from the FBI in the USA. So he's a senior level technologist, and he has contributed and developed the concept of EAFIS, that's Integrated Automatic Fingerprint Identification System. That means somewhere the Internet of the fingerprint automatic systems, putting in network different automatic fingerprint identification systems. That is nothing very simple. You can have the abstract idea about it, that's quite easy to understand, but when it comes to implement such an idea and to make it happen and to make it work in an operational condition 24/7, that's another story. So I look myself forward to listen what James has to tell to us for an hour, and I give him the word.
Thank you, Didier. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me and the audience for listening to what I have to say. And let me tell you, this is not a perfunctory thank you. I left university for the last time in 1979 and have seldom been back. I almost never have an opportunity to talk to students and, frankly, to the academic researchers, except when we're funding the research. So this is a treat for me. I spent 18 hours getting here, and I'm going to spend 18 hours getting back. The only reward is going to be the quality of your questions, and if you're kind enough to tell me something I don't know during the course of this. So please don't hesitate to say something somewhere along the way. Give me some feedback. That is the benefit of doing this. I'm going to talk to you about the FBI fingerprint program and its evolution, and it's gone through 5 distinct phases of evolution where we've tried to insert technology to make it more effective. I believe it's going to go through yet further. Let me take a few moments to put it into context, however. So we have a couple of strategic themes. Virtually everything we do, and that's probably true of all national level forensic and criminal investigative agencies. Virtually everything we do has to do with identification or attribution to human beings. So a key component for us is knowing the individuals in a real sense, and then sharing that information appropriately with others. As to knowing people, there are a lot of aspects of it. Fingerprints are a sub-element of biometrics. Biometrics is just one piece with biographics, behavioral. I didn't really think to include devices in this particular slide, but increasingly that's important to law enforcement agencies as well, because people are seldom separated from their technology in modern countries now. I've highlighted the friction ridge biometrics, fingerprint and palm print on this slide in a bright blue. That's really what I'm going to focus on. I haven't included footprint because it's such a small portion of what we do. But in fact, we have done on occasion casework involving the friction ridges of the feet as well. So the FBI has been engaged with the fingerprint program for 92 years now. That doesn't put us at the beginning of it in the United States. The beginning was roughly in 1897 when the organization that today is the International Association of Chiefs of Police formed a voluntary arrangement. It was a pay-to-play system where those cities that wanted to share criminal history information would share that information with those who had also participated and not others. At that point, it was really based on anthropometry, the Bertillon system. That changed early in the 1900s, as did the recognition by our chiefs of police that they really couldn't afford to operate such a system and have so limited a system. They immediately began petitioning the national government to, one, pay for it, and two, take it over and do it. And it took till 1923 for them to actually gain any traction and persuade anyone to do it. So this is a case where the FBI never sought this particular responsibility, but it was the first of the divisions. We number our divisions, and what today is the Criminal Justice Information Services is Division 1. It is the first and the largest still of the divisions. We have 2,600 government employees and another 1,000 full-time contractors engaged in various criminal justice services. When I came on board with the FBI in 1996, we had about 1,000 full-time fingerprint examiners engaged. It grew before we went operational with the IFAS to about 1,200. And as you'll see later on, we've been able to significantly reduce the labor content and significantly reduce the turnaround time as a result of automation. I'm not going to take you through this slide other than to point out what I've really just pointed out. We've been doing this for a very long time. We got the National Criminal Repository, which was about 810,000 people in 1924, and that mission. In 1933, they added the civil identification mission at the national level, which has gradually grown to encompass the entire country with the background checks for people in positions of trust or where they deal with vulnerable persons. So it's now a very large national program. We began a collaboration with what was then the National Bureau of Standards, now the National Institute of Standards and Technology, in 1963. It was 25 years of R&D before we believed that we were in a position to really build a true full-scale national AFIS. And we've continued to work on that ever since. IAFIS was deployed with initial capability in 1999, fully operational in 2000. I'm going to say more about that later on, and was replaced by next generation identification, the final part going operational in 2014. I think that was an unfortunate choice of naming because I'm sure it won't be the last of our identification systems, and I'm not sure what will come after next generation. And we've already used that name. So this audience, this is probably pointless, but let me put it in context anyway. We have a positive identification program where we're working with 10 prints, and a latent identification, which is dramatically smaller, where we're working with forensic information left at crime scenes. So I want to say a little bit about organization and process. This is a small nation's national fingerprint repository. And it's pretty much useless like this. There's not a whole lot you can do with something that's not indexed, sitting on a tabletop wrapped up in rubber bands. The secret sauce are our processes, not our technology. At the time that we went operational with IAFIS, we had 36 million people in the criminal history files. We were able to operate it. We had, as I say, a large staff. At the peak, we had about 1,200 people. So 75 years of operation with thousands of fallible human beings, when eventually we had the technology that would allow us to run the file against itself and check for multiple instances of the same person with different files, we found out that our manual processes had been 99% effective. Think about what that means. You know, that is like going from kindergarten through a PhD and never getting a grade below 99 on anything. You know, it's incredible accuracy. What I'll go on to say eventually is it's not nearly good enough. But absent process and organization, you really can't have an effective fingerprint system. And that's true today, just as it was true throughout the many years. This is another larger nation's fingerprint system before it was automated, just before it was automated. what we tell people is that normally about 100,000 is the largest manual system that you can operate before you need to insert automation. We've got Morpho in the audience. I'm not sure that that's what they tell people. It's probably 15 people or more and you got to be automated. But you can effectively operate a national system up to about 100,000. And there are still quite a few small nations that do not have APHIS systems, although fewer and fewer all the time. So here are the extremes. This is the first one pre-FBI, the Bureau of Criminal Identification, that operated at the Federal Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas in 1908. The men standing are inmates. The man sitting is a trustee. We, for some time, tried to operate that way. It turns out that that's not a good choice to have convicts operating your national identification system. They don't have a lot to do for amusement purposes. And one of the things that they find entertaining, or found entertaining when we allowed this, was to play games with the FBI. So in the operations deputy's safe out at our facility at Clarksburg, we have some fingerprint cards that they have the normal 10 rolled impressions and 4 plain impressions, but they come from 14 different people. So not a good plan, one we don't allow anymore, one that some nations do still follow. And here on the right, you see identification operations going on in the District of Columbia's Armory. Washington is in the District of Columbia in 1943, and what you see is just a sea of people manually processing fingerprints. This certainly is before digital computers, before the meaningful availability of computers. There were about 18 million people in the system in that time frame. So certainly you can operate something much larger than 100,000 manually if you're willing to spend the money and live with the delays that are involved. So the process that we followed for manual 10-print processing for basically 75 years was that a card would come in. It would come in the mail. We would go to the index cards and actually create an index card, conduct a search of the index files, go retrieve the fingerprint cards that were on file that had similar names, because people do lie about their names and various other information when they're arrested. We'd take them to a fingerprint examiner. They would look at it. If they found a match, then we were done and they could return results. If not, they'd classify them. They'd do a fingerprint-based search of the files, file the new print, and send out a report. Worked well, as I indicated. It was highly accurate, but the reason it was highly accurate was because there were layers and layers and layers of quality assurance. There were 4 different layers of skill to the different examiners. Everything was done with double-blind, 2 examiners independently looking at it. If they both came up with the same conclusion, we were done, other than some quality assurance checks. If they came up with different conclusions, then it went to higher layers of resolution. It turns out that in my country, and I would expect in several of yours, that one of the most serious mistakes that a law enforcement agency can make is to wrongly incarcerate an innocent person. In the United States, what that meant was that they would always sue. The FBI would always settle out of court, and on average it would cost $1 million per occurrence. So we were highly motivated to not have erroneous identifications. But we still would occasionally have one until the 1970s, 1980s. We would have an erroneous identification about every 5 years. Now I'm talking 10 prints, I'm not talking about latent identifications. We would much rather miss someone than to wrongly identify them. Since we've instituted the kind of automation that we have, we've not had an erroneous identification, well, in more than 20 years. And the reason I know that is because if we did, they would sue, and we would settle out of court, and we haven't. So here's some pictures, looking at the hairstyles and the dress. I would say this was sometime in the mid-early 1940s. And this is an indication of what they dealt with. Notice the large numbers of fingerprint cards sitting on the desk, indicative of the kind of volume of activity that they were looking at and processing. You see the microscopes, the hand magnifiers that they used that are still in use in some departments today. They're still for sale. A little more modern than that, but still for sale. So I'm going to talk to you about 5 waves of automation that we've gone through. First wave was entirely mechanical equipment, and it's really before the days of digital computers. Unit record equipment, later called electronic accounting machinery, but it was manual. Then some incremental technology insertion as we were able, working with our partners, to apply pattern recognition, digital signal processing techniques, although they weren't called that then, to fingerprint matching. The identification automated system, which originally had the unfortunate name of AIDS, after discovery of the human immunodeficiency virus, we decided that was a poor name and changed it to IDAS. The IAPA system that I was deeply involved in actually building, and now next generation identification, which I was an advisor on but was not one of the builders of. So before computer matching, as early as the 1930s, we were trying to find ways to automate the index and to speed that up. So you see what's obviously a staged photograph. Nobody would have been actually there with a magnifier standing next to the card sorter to do this. Unfortunately, I can't find any photos from that time that weren't staged, that were natural use of the equipment. But it does, in fact, give you an indication of it. We advanced to the Diebold machines in the 50s through the 80s. What you see there are a few people working around machines. It doesn't give you a sense of the scale. At the peak, we had 547 Diebold machines, all of them full of index cards. It took up a whole floor of a building, basically, just to have those mechanically automated index machines. We tried all kinds of things. We tried putting in a manual beltway that would physically move the fingerprint cards from station to station. It never worked very well. It would tear the cards, for example, so that wasn't terribly useful. But it was something that we really did give a solid try for a couple of years. There's still people around who remember that equipment being there and remember the frustrations of trying to get it to work and dealing with it when it jammed. So something that made a big difference in the United States was not technology, but policy. And I think those of you who are in government or deal with government know that policy frequently is more dominant than technology in what it's possible to do. In the 1964 presidential campaign, when Lyndon Johnson, the incumbent president, was locked in a campaign with Barry Goldwater. Goldwater made crime in the streets an issue, that the federal government really should be doing more to combat crime. To which President Johnson took the position, that's ridiculous. The federal government has no role in crime. That doesn't seem credible perhaps today, but it was entirely credible then. Ours is a federal system, except for criminal activities that occur on federal government property, and most of the property that is occupied is not federal property. The federal government doesn't have law enforcement responsibilities. Law enforcement is primarily a local matter and a state matter. So Johnson clearly won the argument because he was elected and Goldwater was not. But something that Goldwater said must have resonated with him, because in the year after his re-election, he created a presidential commission which has come to be called the Johnson Commission. That's not what it was called at the time, but it's come to be called the Johnson Commission. And they came up with a lot of things that were significant, at least in the United States. The National 911 system for emergency calls came out of that. The idea of police command centers came out of that. A National Crime Information Center was one of the things. The idea that there ought to be a research and development program for law enforcement technology at the national level came out of that and was the genesis of our National Institute of Justice. And I've highlighted in red the most important thing, because it's the one I care about, is that they thought that we really ought to be expending resources toward a semi-automatic fingerprint identification system. So while the FBI, I've already told you, had started some initial R&D work with National Bureau of Standards in 1963, the funding really wasn't there, the public support for it wasn't there, and without that we really wouldn't have been able to go very far. So that's where that came out of, a policy argument at the presidential level. So we did a lot toward that semi-automatic fingerprint system. We recognized that we had two paths that we had to work on, the biographic search as well as the technical search, the biometric search. It turns out that about 2/3 of our identifications could be done with sophisticated analysis of the textual information that was collected. The combination of the names, people lie about their names, they lie about their ages, they lie about lots of things. But they lie in predictable ways, at least when you have enough history with it, you do. So we were actually able to do about 2/3 of the identification just off the biographics, and then use the fingerprint check as a confirmation of it, which dramatically shortened the time that was involved. Separate path of developing the AFERs. So now a little different block diagram of how this worked, with the automated system coming up with candidates based on a match of the minutia that was extracted from the incoming card with minutia that were on file. But then we had what was called a pick and pull function, where human fingerprint examiners would physically go to the card files, retrieve the cards that seemed to have the right Henry classification, take them to more skilled fingerprint examiners who would examine them, and then put them back in the files. Pick and pull involved the full-time efforts of 366 fingerprint examiners. It was the first thing we automated. And because of that, we were able to use that labor as the nucleus of the National Gun Check System. So this is not necessarily the best place. Frankly, the best place to put this chart would have been at the very end, but I wanted to make the point now that we've seen a steady increase in the volume of activity that, I got to look at the big one because I can't read it on that small one. We did the first 100 million 10-print checks roughly in 1945. The next 100 million, 1972, the next 100 million by 1988. By the time that we took IAFIS live, we had done 400 million 10-print checks at the national level. It's accelerating. We're now doing 100 million 10-print checks every 2 years with no clear upper barrier in sight. You know, it's continuing to increase. And this is what the fingerprint files, the criminal master file, looked like when it had 36 million people in it. It was a room full of cards, roughly the size of half of a football field. And I don't really care whether you mean European football or American football. It was roughly half the size of a football field. It's an enormous room full of cards, which we have finally destroyed the last of the cards. Our laboratory division that does our latent identification wanted us to keep all of those physical cards on file, but they weren't willing to help pay for it. So that being the case, eventually they were all destroyed. So let me say a little bit about the IAFIS evolution. We're now in the third phase of evolution of the system. Commercial fingerprint systems emerged in the 1980s. I think Morpho had their first commercial sales somewhere in that time frame. Working with the National Bureau of Standards, we developed, the United States, the ANSI NIST system in '86, which shortly thereafter there was an international standard, an ISO standard, which was roughly the same in content. It wasn't identical, but it was very similar which was really important that there be a way to interchange information between these systems. One of the complaints in the early days, which frankly is still a complaint today in the United States, is the lack of true interoperability between the APHIS systems. Today, they're fully interoperable for tinprints, but they're not fully interoperable for latent identifications. It continues to be a problem. I think that we're going to solve it in the United States by adopting and making mandatory some standards that if the equipment doesn't comply, it can't be sold. But that was critically important at the time, so that as we would develop a national system, there would be some basis for interoperability with the state systems. I already indicated most of the crimes are occurring at the state and local level. They're not occurring at the national level. It was true then, it's true today. We operate the national repository. The data in it is not the FBI's data in most cases. We're just the stewards of the repository. We had an advisory board in that time frame. It was very unhappy. The states were very unhappy with the federal government. Our response time was getting slower and slower and slower. We had enormous backlogs. We really weren't meeting their needs. That unhappiness grew to the point that we were literally threatened that the states would, independently of the federal government, come up with a national system to replace it that would be more responsive to their needs. We had to take that seriously and deal with it. So we put together a advisory policy board that would address the fingerprint system, not just some of the other systems that had previously been the case. And we came up with a three-tier search hierarchy where cities, large counties would have their own automated fingerprint identification system, would migrate the search to the state level or to the regional level if some states wanted to combine, and then migrate that to the national level so that we might, in a relatively brief period of time, have a national level search and identification information passed back. We had the specifications approved in 1992, and then I won't read you the full slide, but in 2000 we had IAFIS fully operational. So the takeaway from this is that it was 11 years from when we conceived of the need for the system until we had the national system fully operational. And you'll see that pattern again when I get to the next generation identification. That system, I think I'll cover that later. So that system operated from initial operation in 1999 until final retirement in 2014 for roughly 15 years. Its purpose was to give the FBI and the nation I say fully automated, that's not entirely true, a fully automated fingerprint identification and criminal history system. I noticed in the footnotes of a couple of different presentations yesterday references to work from Alice O'Toole at the University of Texas and Jonathan Phillips at NIST. So I take from that this audience is well aware of their work showing that combining multiple algorithms along with human examiners can dramatically improve the performance of the system. We operate such a hybrid system. In the IAFIS days, we had 4 different algorithms. I know that because the FBI, with our contractors, built that system and we had full knowledge of the inner workings. I'll tell you at the next stage that we bought the current system from Morpho. And I don't really know what the algorithms are inside it, but I'm pretty sure there are at least 4 different algorithms that are in operation. So there are multiple algorithms in operation. And essentially we have a 3-tiered system now, and we had a 3-tiered system then, where below a certain threshold, we would just declare a miss. Between that and a slightly higher threshold, we would say that we couldn't make the determination and we would refer it to human examiners. And above a threshold, which we call lights out, we would have an automated determination that we would send out unreviewed by human beings. Now when I say that, it wasn't that way day one. It had that capability day one of operating fully automated with no human involvement. But all governments are conservative. The FBI as one of our longer existing government organizations, is more conservative than most. So we actually had, even after we had a fully automated system in place, we used dual-blind human fingerprint examiners to review every machine determination for 50 million transactions. And then we picked a score significantly higher than the highest one where there ever could have been a question about a miss to operate the system with a single human examiner for another 50 billion transactions. We ran 100 million transactions through the fully automated system before we actually enabled the fully automated capability of the system. So it was a very conservative approach, and it continues to be. But notionally, at least, when we went operational, it was fully automated. Our goal was to have a 2-hour response for a criminal inquiry and a 24-hour response for a civil inquiry. Why those numbers? I'm not sure why the 24-hour. It seemed like a good idea to the people that set the rules. But I can tell you for the 2-hour, because pretty much across the nation, that's how long people can be retained in custody before either the laws or the desires of the jailers to get them out of the system will cause them to be released more often than not on their own recognizance, at which point those who knew that they were wanted for a serious crime would abscond and not be available. So we wanted a system that would allow us to identify wanted persons while they were in custody rather than after they had been released. So that was why 2 hours. We wanted to improve latent matching to the user community. Our processes in that time frame, and to a large extent today for latent identification, do not depend on automation. Quite the contrary. When we collect latents from a crime scene, we have suspects, and we have people that we expect their prints will be there. And so we have elimination prints of people that live in the house, for example, that you know you're going to find their fingerprints there. And they may or may not be also suspects, but we only would do a fingerprint search in those occasions where the suspects and the elimination prints didn't match. Until IAFIS, we really didn't get any hits off of latent searches. When you're searching against 30 million people, 36 million people, essentially with a manual system with not a whole lot of automation, you're not really very successful. And before the IDAS, we really only had one successful latent search ever, and that was Lee Harvey Oswald. That may not mean anything in this audience. The murderer of Martin Luther King. There was a fingerprint on the receiver of the firearm. In the late 1960s, after King's assassination, we had riots going on in major cities all over the country. Several blocks of Washington were looted and burned. And J. Edgar Hoover, then FBI director, decided that he would commit whatever labor it took to see if we couldn't get a match. So he actually assigned 1,000 additional people to manually go through the files and see if they could get a match with that latent fingerprint off of those files, and they did. Very surprisingly that would actually be successful, but it was a measure of the desperation. Other than that, you really can't manually search 30 million people for a latent match and have any hope of success. So in any event, I've digressed. We wanted to improve the latent services to where we thought a good number would be 635 searches a day, and if we could return them in 24 hours, that would be a great improvement. And we wanted to eliminate the need to deal with paper fingerprint cards. So here's a new process. I'm not going to go through this because it's pretty obvious, but a point I want to make is that once we did turn on the fully automated capabilities of the system, we would do 76% of the incoming transactions with no human involvement, but we'd still do 24% with single examiner matching. So we'd refer it to an examiner. Now, there were quality control processes on top of that more people would be involved on a sampling kind of basis, or if there were some anomaly in the processing. But in general, only one of our examiners would look at it to make a determination. And this was the technology at the time we went operational. We used optical jukeboxes to store the fingerprint files. Yes, we knew that there were other technologies that would be faster than optical jukeboxes, but they cost more, and by the time that I got involved and they wanted me to change it, it was going to cost $6 million more and add a year to the schedule, and optical jukeboxes made specs, so we went with optical jukeboxes. And we had 26 supercomputers. They're convex computers. They later became Hewlett-Packard supercomputers, and they served us very well for most of 15 years. Maybe I'll show you a picture later. I don't remember if I have it in there, what the current generation is. We used to produce 2 success stories every day. I think it got boring because we don't do that anymore. We have so many success stories on a regular basis that we no longer really collect it. So all I have for you here are some older success stories as an indication. But I'll give you a factoid that I indicated that one of the reasons for the 2-hour response was so we could identify wanted persons while they're in custody. We identify about 20,000 wanted persons a month. So that's a lot of success stories every day. We just don't capture it. So I picked a few, not entirely at random, because they're ones that I had from years ago that I would use in presentations, and they're more serious, but they're indicative of how quickly it's possible to identify things, and that sometimes very long-term crimes are able to be resolved. We've been able to solve with the IAFA system, we're doing even better with NGI, but with the IAFA system, we were able to solve 37-year-old homicides, 9-year-old homicides, crimes that had been on the books for really extended periods of time that the detectives, the police officers responsible for had taken a personal interest in and had tried everything. They'd searched all the surrounding jurisdictions, they'd done everything they could think of, and it stayed alive in their memories, and when we brought the new system with its capabilities on board, they would dredge up old cases and submit it and get hits. Sometimes they would get hits that their state systems were not able to get because of the sophistication of the algorithms. When I say that I'm really, among other things, talking about latent hits. And so it was a big success, but even so, when you look at the number of searches that we would do and then the number of hits that we would have, it turned out with the older system, we were only having about a 1% hit rate, which I always thought was shockingly low. But our latent examiners were very pleased with it because the alternative was no hits at all. Unfortunately, the events of 9/11, in addition to all the other catastrophic, cataclysmic changes that they involved for the United States, they made the IAFA system obsolete. Actually 3 of my colleagues had gone to a meeting at the Eisenhower Executive Office building, which is part of the White House complex, to talk about the need to better tie together the information the State Department has with Homeland Security, with the military departments. Military didn't have a whole lot in that time frame, but it had some. And in the course of it, it became clear that a system that had been designed to handle a maximum of 62,510 print checks a day for the first 2 years, after which we'd have the backlog worked off and it'd decline into the high 40,000s of checks a day, wasn't going to begin to cover the volume that was now going to be expected. So shortly after it went fully operational, like a year after the IAFAS was fully operational, it became clear that it could not be expanded to meet the nation's needs. So we began again the process of coming up with the next system. But having said that, we were achieving the 2-hour. In fact, I'll I think I've taken out the slide because the new system's performance isn't quite as good time-wise as the old system's was for some complicated reasons. We were typically turning around criminal inquiries in under 8 minutes, and it was not unusual to be returning civil inquiries in under 20 minutes, even though the commitment was 2 hours and 24 hours. But the average daily tin-print checks grew to 170,000 a day, which is just under 3 times the ultimate design capacity of the original system. So we introduced new technology. There were a number of things that mid-1990s technology, which was what we were designing toward, caused us to do things that those who've grown up in technically in more recent years would find ridiculous. Like we had mirrored RAID, but our mirrored RAID wasn't for reliability. It was so we could swap information in and out of the supercomputers more rapidly, because we couldn't actually load all the information into the physical memory that could be addressed by a computer in that time frame. As the technology advanced, we didn't need to do things like that, and it became possible to put in newer equipment. But even so, there were just limitations on the old design on what we were going to be able to do. The record for IAFIS was 300,000 transactions when we processed the last decennial census. I don't have it on my later slides, but looking at all transactions, the new system has actually handled over 600,000 transactions in a single day. So it has a lot more capacity, and we're nowhere near testing the limits of it yet. We needed some new services that we didn't have previously. We needed a 10-second response. We hadn't had that before. We needed a national palm print system. That had not been one of our objectives. We needed to do investigative face matching. While we had an interstate photo file, we didn't have any services associated with it. And because of that, very few put photos into the interstate photo file because it didn't accomplish anything for them. I think at the peak we had about 8 million photos in the interstate photo file, which if you then had the identification number, you could get the photo back, but you couldn't do any matching against it. And they wanted mobile services, which had never been one of our goals with the earlier system. So we came up with the idea of next generation identification, and it had a number of different goals: an improved fingerprint repository, a multimodal capability, and the modes that we were going to start out with were fingers, palms, faces, and irises, all of which has been built, not all of which has been made operational. An effective interstate photo system with the face matching, that we would do something to improve dispositions. You know, our goal with the tin-print program is to have a complete and accurate criminal history system supported by positive identification, fingerprints being that form of positive identification. What we actually have achieved is a fairly complete and extremely accurate arrest system. We have great information on who's been arrested and for what. I didn't really talk about it earlier, but I had a high-level flow chart of the complexities of our criminal system. And there are many, many, many paths that one can follow after being arrested that don't necessarily result in conviction. You know, there are people that are never charged. There are people that are charged and then that ultimately the prosecutors decide that they will not expend the resources to prosecute in court. There are people that are convicted and then are given there are pretrial diversions that are done by the judges. There are post-trial diversions where people never go into the system in the first place. Charges vary because of limited prosecutorial resources. While if a person is arrested for homicide, it's unlikely they'll get charged with a lesser offense. It is entirely possible that a robbery might get converted into a felonious assault or a simple assault or some other charge that's difficult to associate with the arrest. So we really only have dispositions on file for about 42% of the arrests that are on file. So we don't have a complete and accurate criminal history system. One of the major goals here was to improve that disposition information. Because otherwise, when you send the results back, what you're sending is a task now to get in touch with all of the inconclusive information and find out whether or not it has any bearing on your case. Further automation of the quality checks and other things that are not on that slide. This is our piano chart. It was more interesting as we were going through it and checking off what had been completed and what hadn't. The only thing that hasn't been completed now is technology refreshment, and technology refreshment will go on for the life of the system. But there are a number of things you see in there. The advanced fingerprint identification, a repository of individuals of special concern that we give a 10-second response to, the infrastructure latents and palms, wrapback, which is important and a new concept. Civil identification in the past meant that before you could take on a position of trust, that you had to have a background check. In the interest of time, I'll not get into the details of that. But except for federal employees, the FBI did not retain those prints. So you had the check, and that was that. You know, once you passed it, you really had a free pass unless your employer had reason to do a subsequent check. Some of you may have heard the expression, what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. Not anymore. The wrapback system is a continuous vetting system, that if you have the authority to conduct the check in the first place and have gotten the informed consent of the subject, the contributors can direct the FBI to keep their prints on file and to check every incoming arrest against all of those on-file prints and notify the employers immediately if that person is arrested for an offense somewhere else in the nation. So we now have a national wrapback system. That does not mean that it's in full use. Quite the contrary, hardly anybody's using it as yet. But we anticipate over the course of the next decade or so that the vast majority of the people that are subject to a civil background check will be enrolled in wrapback and will be retained on file for so long as they're in one of those positions of trust. So that's a big change that's available, which I don't think the civil liberties people, they're aware of it, but I don't think that the penny has dropped for them of what the implications are. We expect that a very large segment of the adult population of the country will be enrolled in the wrapback system. The face photo search and then the iris pilot. The reason that it's an iris pilot is that our Office of Management and Budget came up with the not unreasonable point, why are you doing that? There aren't a whole lot of irises left at crime scenes. Well, that's true. It is not true that there is no capability at crime scenes to recover irises, but largely that's true. But what is missing in that kind of analysis is the huge benefit that the custodial systems, the prisons, the jails and whatnot, can have from an iris system where they don't have to physically handle oftentimes violent individuals, that they can collect their iris at a distance and do a highly reliable match. So we anticipate at some point that pressure from the states and the cities will cause the White House to decide that maybe that pilot ought to become an operational capability. But for now, it's just a pilot. We haven't taken that operational, although they're still using the pilot. So next generation identification. We became aware that we needed to replace IAFIS roughly in late 2003. We put together some concepts, had discussions with our advisory policy board in the spring of 2004, awarded contracts in 2007, and it was fully operational in 2014. Another 11 years went by in building it. IAFIS cost $640 million to build. NGI cost $1.2 billion. Now clearly this is not something that every 10 years we can follow that pattern and get twice as much money and come up with a new system. So we've got to find a way to technologically refresh NGI without having to do a wholesale replacement at that kind of price. We achieved all of our objectives. We were within budget. We were slightly ahead of schedule, and we achieved all the technical objectives. Our lights out tinprint search reliability with this new system is 99.6%. That's without the human component. We still have human examiners involved. We are now able to do 93% of the searches with no human involvement, with roughly 7% of the searches being referred to human examiners. I'm oversimplifying in the interest of time and not putting you to sleep. So some statistics. Today we have 71 million people in the criminal repository. We have another 40 million people in the civil who are not also in the criminal. There are people that are in both files, but I've just broken it down separately. So at this time, we have 111 million people on file. We used to claim that ours was the largest biometric system in the world. That's certainly no longer true. Homeland Security has something like 180 million separate individuals on file. The Indian system has over 1 billion people on file. I'm not sure in terms of biometric images. We have over 3 billion images on file. Nobody else has shared their numbers with me, so I don't know if others have more images on file or not than we do. But we certainly don't have the largest anymore. Daily averages, things have changed over the years. When I started with the FBI 20 years ago, 55% of our tinprint searches were criminal and 45% were civil. You can see that those numbers have changed to where today about a third of the inputs, sometimes as little as a quarter, is criminal, and the balance of it are civil searches of one kind or another. This is the end of fiscal 2015, and I believe that it's distorted. Distorted in the sense that we were still working out some of the transitional issues. There are complexities with taking any major system operational. And so during the first couple of months of operation, there were some significant outages, significant delays. So we ended up at the end of the year with the average criminal response time being 23 minutes, 23 and a half minutes, and the average civil being 33 minutes. Rapid IDs we were doing in 9 seconds. Today we're doing in about 4 seconds. Latent feature searches we were doing in 2 hours, and image searches we were doing in a little over 2 hours. I indicated that we had a search reliability of 99.6%. I didn't tell you, but I will now, that it's at a 0.103% false alarm rate prior to human quality control efforts, which essentially get it down to 0. And at the federal level, 100% of what we receive is electronic. We don't get paper cards. That's not exactly true. We get a trickle of paper cards in, but it really is a trickle. When you're looking at anywhere from an average of 170,000 a day, and some days almost 250,000, if you get in 5 or 10 paper cards, it really is pretty insignificant. We have a lot of contributing partners. At the end of 2015, we had received fingerprint arrest cards from 23,507 different law enforcement locations, and we have a similar number of civil contributors. So I'm going to break it down a little bit further to give you more of a sense of it, but I'm not really going to go through the details of this. Note the reject rate of all transactions. Now this is for Wednesday, June 1st. We actually have these statistics on a daily basis, and we can get higher resolution than that. But we had a composite reject rate that day of 2.25% of all the transactions. And you see that there were 219,000 checks that came in. So while it might seem that a 2% reject rate is pretty good, that's an awful lot of rejects that are occurring with that volume. Other things, we had work in process as of the end of the day of just over 9,000 transactions. Some days it's as little as 0, not many. Some days it's higher than that. Typically it's a little lower than that. For the year to date, well, first of all, for the year to date, 6 minutes and 37 seconds on a criminal transaction, an hour and 21 minutes and 36 seconds for the civil transaction. So I told you earlier, under 20 minutes under IAFIS. First year, I was a little embarrassed about 30 odd minutes. My goodness, an hour and 21 minutes. What's going wrong? Why is it we've spent all this money on this new automation and the civil response is getting worse? Well, note that the committed response time is 24 hours. It turns out that we have a lot of different transactions. You know, we don't just have criminal transactions and civil transactions. We have a variety of criminal transactions. Criminal answer required, criminal non-urgent. What that really means is they know who it is. They don't really care what the answer is. They're just complying with the process of submitting the people. So they don't care if they ever get an answer, but we nevertheless do the check. We've got interactions with international partners that, without getting into the complexity of it, there is so much back and forth before it's ever submitted that there's no particular urgency of when the transaction's processed. All with different reject rates, different processing times, different goals. There isn't even a goal for how quickly we're going to do this, because typically months have gone by before we ever agree that we're going to do the search. There's only one exception to that. With Canada, they can directly do searches against our system, and we can against theirs. Otherwise, there is no country in the world that directly does searches against the FBI or allows the FBI to do searches against them. Notice all the different kinds of civil transactions. Also notice that there's an expedited civil transaction. If they want to pay a slightly higher fee, we'll give them a 15-minute response time. Our Congress, in its wisdom, has decided that criminal inquiries will be paid for by the taxpayer, but civil inquiries should be paid for by the people that benefit from it, not the taxpayer. So all the civil systems, there's a fee associated with it. So notice the complexity of all this. So let me add to that then that we have huge excess capacity in the current system. The current technology uses commodity blades, and because of oddities of the procurement process and when it was bought, most of the blades are 8-core blades. Some of the blades are 4-core blades, and we have 6,000 blades at the moment. We really only have a utilization of about 10%. We have huge excess capacity. So it's not automation that's limiting the process. It's really the human element. It's the mix of the transaction types that come in. Some of them are more complex than others. And it's the labor costs associated with it. We now have, I think I'll show it to you on a later slide, well, about out of time anyway. We now have 134 fingerprint examiners to operate a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week system. So, and there have been some changes of management, as you would expect in a program that's been going on now for 20 years. And the current management is taking the position that as long as we meet the committed response times, that it's not unreasonable to do better, but to do it in a way that minimizes the cost of the human labor. So essentially, with the automation that we have now, we can achieve any response time that we choose to commit the resources to. And our objective now is to reduce the human component yet further, the number of things that have to be referred to humans. So here's a really busy slide that I won't take you through other than to point out that with the humans, a portion of the process, we run a Lean Six Sigma program. As of 2002, we had a 99.48% search accuracy. 2003, 99.98. From 2013 and later, our quality people say it's 100%. Well, you know that can't possibly be true. So what I'm saying is it's just unmeasurable. You know, we don't run enough transactions through to be able to measure what the reliability is. Incredibly accurate, no false identifications, but we have 2% composite criminal rejects. and 3% composite civil rejects. Now that really seems good. But let's talk about the implications of making a mistake, just briefly. I won't take you through the numbers, you'll just have to trust me on it. Basically, it means we could potentially miss 12 to 13 wanted persons a day. You know, if they're wanted for serial jaywalking, nobody's wanted for serial jaywalking. But if that's what they were wanted for, who cares? It's not important. But if it's this guy, this is an IAFIS system miss. This man was arrested 3 different times, processed through IAFIS. We missed him all 3 times. He was wanted for interstate rape all that time. He was not caught. Subsequently, I won't take you through the details because they're sickening, but he brutally murdered, Lisa Nichols here. And one of my colleagues got to explain to her daughters how it was that our system could have missed him. At the time, the IAFIS objective was 95% search reliability, which at one time was a really good search reliability. It's certainly not in today's technology, but it was a really good search reliability. One of my colleagues points out the public is entirely satisfied with any search reliability we come up with as long as we don't miss anybody. We missed this guy. As you look at his incredible criminal curriculum vitae, you see that this man murdered 11 people that we know of, that he's confessed to, was involved in multiple rapes. It's just a terrible case. When you miss something like that, it has an enormous impact. We miss 12 to 13 a day. There are others that we're not aware of that are just as serious. So we need a better system. Not because of technology, but because of policy changes. The overall quality, now this is dated, this is from the IAFIS time frame, but I don't have any reason to believe it's changed. The overall quality of our repository has steadily declined for a 50-year period. That starts in the 60s when we started accepting approximate classifications rather than true Henry classifications. So what would cause us to prevent these men? Since we're not in the United States, you may not recognize any of these photographs, but these are the men who crashed the airliners into the World Trade Center and into the Pentagon, and we're trying to crash an airliner into the White House, but we're foiled in that. What would keep them from getting a visa today? Seems like I've missed something. Well, maybe I'll come to it later. Probably not. Well, we share fingerprints with all the other government major capabilities and have for some time. We have a 3 times increase in our latent search reliability. It's tremendously accurate now. The response time is much better. Our repository of individuals of special concern gives a 3 to 7 second response rate, or hit rate rather, of 3 to 7% and a response time of 4 seconds. And that's all I was going to say on this topic, other than if you had good questions. And I think I've eaten up all the time for questions. So thank you for your attention.
I look at the organizer. I hope we have a little time for questions, and if we are 2 minutes late, maybe we start here.
Well, the performances you had with the templates now is impressive. Do you see similar performances to be achieved with face matching in the future?
So I'll offer my opinion. The FBI doesn't have a firm opinion, and I assume some of you know Richard Voderbrucke. He's our lead for a face examination. It's my opinion that the face matching technology is roughly where the fingerprint matching technology was in 1988. Richard says, no, I'm wrong, it's more like 94. So what does that mean? We were able to launch IAFIS in 1988. What's different is we had 1,200 skilled fingerprint examiners. We have like 25 or 30 skilled face examiners. If we were willing to make the labor commitment to have face examiners and make the financial investment with our partners that we made, I'm confident that we could do positive identification with faces. What I'm not confident of is that we'll choose to make the investment either in the people or in the technology. It may just have to wait until industry naturally does it. But yes, I believe that, and so do the leads for this, that we can do that with face. We're just not there today.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a question on the quality. You illustrated the importance of the quality and how the quality improved over time. But how do you deal with altered fingerprints? Do you spot them when they are submitted to the system? Do you flag them? And do you have some clue on how many flagged altered fingerprints are in the system?
So that's an amazingly insightful question, and the answer is not very well. We don't have a systematic process yet of identifying it. We get leads from the various states. What we're seeing, and it was initially pointed out to us in a couple of locations in Massachusetts, when we ran it down, there's a gang operating out of the Dominican Republic that has teamed with some medical doctors that are engaged in the alteration of fingerprints. Not really successful at grafting on other images. You know, they're not successful today in assuming other people's identities, but successful in concealing their own. What are we doing about it? We have some sponsored research to develop techniques to do this. I think most of you will know Anil Jain. He's done some of the research as sponsored research. There are others that are less eminent than Anil who are also working at it. We hope to insert that. I think that we're going to have to go a step further than that. There is such a focus on international terrorism as well as the prospects of nation states engaging in espionage that I think we're going to have some better capture technology. Had I not eaten up all the time with what I did, I would have talked about places we need to go. We need to do better with our capture technology. We have a number of initiatives underway to improve the capture technology to address what you're talking about, but also to address the rejects. We've got way too many rejects. We shouldn't have that many rejects.
Other questions?
I'd like new information too, whether now or later. You know, I don't think I know it all. If you would share with me things that are relevant that I don't know, I'd be grateful. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about iris. So,
about
iris?
IDAS?
Iris biometric.
Okay.
So you said you had a pilot running in. Share some of the lessons learned, or what was your experience? Was it for mobile ID or
So we're not using Iris Mobile. We're only using it in custodial situations, in some jails, and in some prisons. The Bureau of Prison is using it. It's phenomenally effective. You know, it has many side benefits to it, but probably the most effective is the not having to physically handle the incarcerants, which is a tremendous safety benefit for the officers in those circumstances. I know you want something more detailed than that. Ask a more detailed question and I'll try.
So going forward, whenever your partners are submitting, say, fingerprint cards, are you encouraging them to send iris images as well to build the data set?
Not really, and the reason for the not really, you know, I said in passing that last year we got arrest submissions from 23,507 locations. That's an awful lot of places. We don't fund them. So they have to spend their own money to incorporate it. And more importantly, they have to incorporate it in their processes. Getting them to change their processes without them having some direct benefit is all but impossible for people that you can't direct them to do things. They have to, this is a national voluntary system. It's not compulsory. They don't have to do it. So I think that the most realistic place for us to have the repository grow is in the jails and in the prisons where they actually do get a direct benefit out of it. Also, in the United States at least, the capture equipment for iris is very expensive. It's typically in the range of $20,000, as is LiveScan equipment. It's still very expensive. Without getting a direct benefit back from it, most of our contributors that are relatively small police departments are not going to make that kind of an investment. So no, we're not even trying to encourage it.
Thank you.
Still have time for questions?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I can understand your awareness regarding false rejections and people who's missing them. What about false positives? Because that also from the forensic point of view, it's also a very important question. Even that if those are not error-free.
So as I covered, I think, a little earlier, we've not had at least a detected false positive in over 20 years. The combination of the technology and then the quality control systems on top of that have caused us to not have any. It's not a measurable rate. I mean, clearly this is probabilistic. You know that. I'm sure you teach these courses. But the controls are so tight that we just have not, it's been more than 20 years since we've had a false positive. With the 10 prints, that's not the same as with the latents. So I wish I had a more satisfying answer, but. And we were pretty confident we would know if it was a false positive, at least it resulted in an arrest, because they would sue us and we would settle out of court, and they haven't. A false positive with the civil, I think we'd also become aware of because people would protest, no, that's not me, and we're not having that either.
Okay.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate it. If you have anything you would contribute to my knowledge, I'd be even more grateful. Maybe we could do that separately.
Thank you very much.